18.6.2 Foucault. Michel Foucault is a philosopher who was an even more pure example of psychopathy than Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, I believe, wasn't always a psychopath. Wittgenstein's early days, he tried to do good work. When he failed, rather than admit defeat, and rather than deal with the shame he must have felt, he psychopathized. He needed time to construct a new, bogus narrative relative to which his painful Tractatus-related realizations about himself meant nothing. He needed time to psychopathize, this being why he retreated into virtual solitude for 10 years. But Foucault was a psychopath from day one. At no point in his career did he show the slightest interest in the truth. His writing is even more obscure than Wittgenstein's, and when he contracted HIV, he had unprotected sexual intercourse with hundreds of women, without telling them about his condition. Despite this well-known fact, he is revered by professors of women's studies and other disciplines, for example anthropology, that are staffed primarily by women, and one of whose objectives is to identify the forces responsible for the oppression of women. How can this be? Even though Foucault's work, like Wittgenstein's, makes little or no sense, certain themes clearly run through it. Truth is a lie told by the patriarchy and therefore doesn't exist. So-called principles of reasoning and rules of logic are machinations devised by the running dogs of capitalism to ensure that women and other traditionally disempowered groups continue to be dominated by moneyed Westerners. This is a Marxist feminist version of what Wittgenstein said. Another important similarity between Foucault and Wittgenstein was that each cultivated an enormous cult of personality. Had they written clearly, like Carl Hempel or Arthur Papp, they wouldn't have been seen as gurus, and their work would have been evaluated in the same dispassionate way in which people evaluate the work of Hempel and Papp. Even Russell, who to this day is still considered the greatest philosopher of the last 100 years, isn't seen as a guru. There is no cult of personality surrounding him, and those who find fault with his work never try to save it by ascribing hidden meanings to it. The reason is that the respect of Russell's person is contingent on respect for his work. But with Wittgenstein and Foucault, it is the opposite. It is only as far as one has respect for Wittgenstein and Foucault that one has respect for their work. Their work, taken on its own, is meaningless. After reading one page of either author, practically anyone would stop reading, unless he were given some ex parte assurance that, if only he'd press on, he'd discover treasure troves of genius. Having read most of what Wittgenstein wrote that was published, along with the leading explanations of it, and having read a fair amount of Foucault, I can only say there's nothing there. Those epiphanous discoveries never happen. What does sometimes happen is that one invests so much time and energy in those authors that, rather than admit that one has been on a fool's errand for however many years, and rather than admit that one's dissertation was a farce, one becomes part of the lie that perpetuates the thought-crippling myth that it's worth one's time to study what these two wrote. Willful obscurity is not merely evidence of psychopathy, it is psychopathy. There are great thinkers, for example Kant, who write obscurely, but the obscurity is not deliberate, and ultimately much of what they're saying is clear, even though it has to be read a few times for its meaning to emerge. Had Kant written more clearly, it would be more enjoyable to read his prose, and one wouldn't have to work so hard to figure out what he was saying. But if one is willing to trudge through Kant's prose, one usually finds that it's unambiguously making a point, and that point is very often an illuminating one. I cannot understand most of Spinoza's ethics. Spinoza tried to model that work of his on Euclid's Elements. The results, for some reason, was a text that few people understand. But there are long passages in the Ethics that are as clear as a bell and that contain sparkling insights. And Spinoza's other works are clear and good. Kant and Spinoza were not psychopaths. So obscurity isn't necessarily a sign of psychopathy. But willful obscurity is a sign of psychopathy, especially when it's accompanied, as it was in Wittgenstein's case and in Foucault's, by a refusal to provide clarification. I will end this book right here. There will be no concluding remarks. Any attempt to distill the material put forth in the preceding pages into a single tidy conclusion would involve my imposing a false veneer of unity on that material, which, in its turn, would involve either my lying to myself, and thus sociopathizing, or lying to you, and thus criminalizing.